Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the third annual Greeley Lecture for Peace and Social Justice. My name is Frank Clooney. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions, and I'd like to welcome you to the Divinity School, to the center, and to this occasion tonight. We have a short but honorable history of the Greeley Lecture. It has been made possible by the McLean Greeley Foundation for Peace and Justice. And the fund was established in order that there might be events in justice here at the Divinity School. It also supports a program in international interfaith work in the summers. We're sending 2 more students abroad this summer to work in the interfaith area. It is meant to promote here on campus and around the world work in peace, social justice, interreligious dialogue, hoping to reach an audience on campus and then in the wider perspective. The gift was made in honor of the Reverend McLean Greeley, who had his Bachelor in Sacred Theology here at the Divinity School in 1933. He lived his life and his ministry and testified throughout to the belief that people of all backgrounds and faiths are deeply connected to one another and should work together for positive social change. So we're very grateful to members of the Greeley family and the foundation for their support for our work and this lecture tonight. We've had 2 previous speakers in this series, just for your information. Tomáš Halík from the Czech Republic spoke in 2009 on negative eschatology and interfaith dialogue. And last year, Dr. Kiran Martin from New Delhi spoke on Beyond Distinction, Beyond Difference, Transforming Lives in Delhi's Slum Communities. And Ibu Patel from the Interfaith Youth Corps will be here next year as our speaker. But we're particularly honored tonight to have Marshall Gantz from the Kennedy School of Government here with us to speak on the theme of Self, Us Now, Hillel's 3 questions. In case you're not familiar with those questions, at least one version of them is this: if I am not for myself, then who will be for me? And when I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? So we'll get to that in a moment. But who is Marshall Gantz? Many of you know Marshall Gantz, and he needs no introduction, but nonetheless he will get one. Marshall Gantz is Senior Lecturer in Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. He entered Harvard College in the fall of 1960. In 1964, a year before graduating, he left to volunteer as a civil rights organizer in Mississippi. In 1965, he joined Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, and over the next 16 years, he gained experience in union, community issues, and political organizing, and became the director of organizing for the farm workers movement. In the 1980s, he worked with grassroots groups to develop effective organizing programs, designing innovative voter mobilization strategies for local, state, and national electoral campaigns. In 1991, in order to deepen his intellectual understanding of his work, he returned to Harvard College, and after his 28-year leave of absence, returned to Harvard into the classroom, completed his degree, stayed on for an MPA at the Kennedy School, and in 2000 completed his PhD in sociology. He teaches, researches, and writes on leadership, organization, and strategy in social movements, civic associations, and politics. His writing is diverse in a number of fields. I'll just give you a sample of things that he's published in recent years. In 2000, an article entitled Resources and Resourcefulness, Strategic Capacity in the Unionization of California Agriculture. Or in 2004, Duty to the Race, African American Fraternal Orders and the Legal Defense of the Right to Organize. Or in 2010, Leadership, Membership, and Voice, Civic Associations that Work. And on a more popular level, he has many articles in popular periodicals, such again as these examples: Organizing as Leadership in the Encyclopedia of Leadership, Staying Connected to Our Moral Sources in the TPM Cafe, and in Shema, Hillel's Questions, A Call to Leadership. He has several books, one co-authored with Leda Skopal and Ariane Liazos, What a Mighty Power We Can Be, African American Fraternal Groups and the Struggle for Racial Equality. And then a more recent book, 2009, Why David Sometimes Wins, Leadership, Organization, and Strategy in the California Farm Workers Movements. Last year there was a very wonderful article in the Nation magazine about, I think, February or January 2011, in which Sasha Abramsky interviewed Marshall and says this about the book, which I think maybe gives you a feel for the work that Marshall does. Why David Sometimes Wins is about why Chavez's farm worker movement was so successful in comparison with other unions like the Teamsters that had tried and failed to establish a permanent presence in California's fields. Yes, Goliath was more powerful than David, and yes, if they'd chosen to fight using the expected weaponry of sword and shield, Goliath would have creamed his puny opponent. But by thinking outside the box, grabbing a slingshot instead of a sword, David had neutralized the big guy's advantage. Chavez and his companions, outfinanced, outmanned, opposed by business owners and law enforcement, viewed with suspicion by other labor leaders, had worked out grassroots strategies, connected viscerally with the impoverished, disenfranchised grape pickers. He had worked out a way, Marshall in the book, to blend the stories, to create a narrative binding workers and organizations into one large family, identifying your strengths and your opponent's weaknesses, being willing to think outside the box, Gantz tells his students, were core ingredients of good organization building. Before I met Marshall the first time, a few months ago, I had already heard a lot about him from his students, and students of the Divinity School and students of the Kennedy School and around the university find so compelling studying with Marshall, his work, his ability to give people new faith, new hope that things can change, and showing them practically how to do it. And the last thing I'll do is just point out several of the courses that Marshall offers that I think maybe sound to me, at least from the titles, to be typical of this move. Public narrative, identity, agency, and action. Public narrative, conflict, collaboration, and coherence. Moral leadership, self, other, and action. Practicing democracy, leadership, community, and power. Faith in leadership in a fragmented world. Social movements, law stories, and lawmaking. So we bring here tonight before you a speaker who has done the academic work, who has done the teaching, who has been out in the field in some of the most important places and moments in our recent history, and brings it all before us tonight. So let us welcome our speaker, Marshall Gantz.
So good afternoon. Yes, hello. Thank you. Let's try again. Good afternoon. All right, much better. This is kind of weird the way they have this set up. It's a little strange angle here. But anyway, thank you for the opportunity to reflect with you this afternoon. Introductions are always a little scary because you worry about being able to live up to what's suggested. But thank you, Frank. This afternoon, we're going to reflect about leadership, moral leadership, what that might require of us. I'm going to frame this reflection in terms of the three questions posed by Rabbi Hillel in the Wisdom of the Fathers in the first century, share my own journey to this understanding of leadership, and in particular consider the role of narrative, or what I call public narrative, as a way to access moral resources that can enable agency, which is at the center of moral action. So the approach to leadership that I'm going to talk about, as I say, is based on these three questions, and let me repeat them. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, when? These three questions right away present the question of the relationship of self, other, and action, which I believe to be at the core of what leadership practice is all about. The fact that they're questions and not answers is also important, because to enter the world of action is to enter the world of uncertainty, of the unknown, of the novel, and of change. It's to enter the world with a sense of questions as opposed to answers. It's very interesting because Hillel doesn't say this. He says, ask these questions. Because entering into the world of action, because we can't predict the future, and so action is always uncertain, poses three kinds of challenges. There's a challenge to the hands. Do I have the skills to deal with these new challenges that I'm faced with? It's a challenge to the head. Can I figure out how to use the resources I have in new ways to achieve my purposes given this challenge? And finally, it's a challenge to the heart. How can I find the courage, the hopefulness, the forbearance to be able to deal with this kind of uncertainty? So, thought of this way, leadership then, it sort of lays a foundation for an understanding of leadership that I've come to adopt, which is the following: that it's about accepting responsibility, which relates to the self, for enabling others. This is not a notion of leadership as star in the firmament illuminating all with brilliance. It's a social, a relational understanding of leadership to achieve purpose under conditions of uncertainty. And again, I want to emphasize uncertainty, because when everything's working fine, when everything's all predictable and everything's going, all the routines are in place, what do you need leadership for? Everything's like operating. It's when things are ambiguous, when they're not working, when they're novel, when they're contradictory, when they're in tension. That's where the adaptive, what my friend Ronnie Heifetz calls the adaptive dimension of leadership, comes into play. So it's not so much, again, it's not so much about leadership as a knower as it is a leadership as a learner of how to deal with these kinds of challenges and how to enable others to deal with them. So it's not about the exercise of control, but rather how to embrace uncertainty and move through it purposefully. Understood in that way, too, leadership is not about position or person, but it's about practice. A practice that can be drawn upon by anyone in almost any position of authority. Of course, there are structures of authority that can facilitate this kind of leadership and others that can kind of inhibit this kind of leadership more. So that's the sort of general approach here. Now, the way I was introduced to the practice of leadership was through organizing. And organizing as a form of leadership is not just about exercising your own leadership, it's about developing the leadership of others and building community around that leadership, and then figuring out how that community can transform its resources into the sources of power that it needs to achieve its purposes. So it's constituency-based, it's leadership development-based, and it's outcome-based. It's not about engaging with clients, providing services to clients that to do for others. And the Latin root of client is inclinare, one who to depend upon, to lean upon. That's not my understanding of this. It's not about marketing products to customers who purchase, exchange. It's about enabling a community to become a constituency. And the Latin roots for constituency are constare, which means to stand together. In other words, the work of an organizer is to enable a community to stand together, to discern its purposes and to mobilize the resources to act on those purposes. Now, how did I get there? I think these Hillel three questions, I think I first asked them to myself in 1964 when I was in my third year at Harvard College and dropped out I hadn't planned to drop out then, but I had left to volunteer for the Mississippi Summer Project with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi. You reflect back and think about what was for me certainly a life-altering, a profoundly life-altering choice. You sort of think, well, what was that all about? And as I reflect, I think there were three elements that went into that. I had grown up in Bakersfield, California. My father was a rabbi there, my mother a teacher. But we had lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War when he was a chaplain in the American Army. And they brought families over. And his work was mostly with survivors, Holocaust survivors. And so as a child, I met people whose lives had been shattered by that horror, who were trying to find hope someplace, somewhere. My 5th birthday party was in what were called DP camps, displaced person camps, that was all children. which I thought was really cool until later I understood why it was only children, because the parents had all been taken in the war. And of course, it was my mother's idea that I would give presents rather than receive them. Not my idea, I can assure you. But it meant that the Holocaust was a reality in our home, and my parents interpreted it to me, though, not as being simply a consequence of anti-Semitism, but of racism, with the simple understanding that racism kills. Not a complex, ideological, complicated argument. Very simple, racism kills. Well, of course, that's what the civil rights movement was challenging. That's what it was all about. It was trying to stop the deadly force of racism. And secondly, as an RK, I don't know if there's any PKs here. You know what PKs are? You should know over here at the Divinity School, huh? Preacher's kids. All right. Well, so RKs are rabbis' kids. It's the sort of same kind of deal. You're supposed to, you have to go to everything, and you also are supposed to be perfect all the time, which has a whole other set of issues attached to it, as I'm sure you can appreciate. But I really love the Passover Seders, and it's getting to be Passover time now. And I love the telling of the story. The book is called the Haggadah, which means the story. And the story is told of the journey from slavery to freedom, and with food, which is also very nice. And there's a part where they point to the children, because the children are the focus of that story, because the idea is for the children to learn the story, so they can tell the story. And it's through the telling of the story that the people continue. But there's a part where they look at you and say, "You were slaves in Egypt." I say, "Excuse me. I've never been a slave. I've never been to Egypt. What are you talking about?" And it took me a while to figure out that the point was that story is not the property of one people, place, or time, but is a story that's retold generation after generation. And in my generation, it was being retold as the civil rights movement. They even spoke the language of the Exodus. I mean, it was no stretch. And so the question was, where do you stand? Are you with Pharaoh's army over there, or where are you? And the third thing is that the civil rights movement was a movement of young people. Dr. King, when he led the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, anybody know how old he was? Oh, not that old. He was 25. Shall I ask? No, I won't. He was 25. I mean, it was a movement of young people. People 18, 19, 20 years old were the freedom riders and the sit-ins and all the rest of it. And it's interesting, because then it was looking at my peers and sort of trying to justify how, if I shared their values, I couldn't share their action. And Walter Brueggemann, the Protestant theologian, has an interesting book called The Prophetic Imagination, in which he talks about prophetic vision, transformational vision occurring at the intersection of two dimensions. One is criticality, which is a clear understanding of the world's pain, of its suffering, and of its limits, coupled, however, with hope, a sense of the world's possibilities, of its promise, and what it can be. And young people come of age almost with a critical eye on the world they find, and almost of necessity, hopeful hearts. And that conjunction of critical eye and hopeful heart creates a deep affinity between young people and change, and social change. And it was certainly so for my generation. And the civil rights movement spoke to that. So I left Harvard, went to Mississippi, began working with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that's where I got my political education, with all due respect to Harvard. And it was very important, because it shaped what I would do. There was so much inequality on any measure between blacks and whites: housing, healthcare, education. Whites were here and blacks were here. It was pretty obvious. But it was also apparent that bringing some medical supplies or a few books was not going to change anything. That the person who brought them might feel good. Charitable act. But that's when I began to understand the difference between charity and justice. The difference between charity and justice, because underneath all those inequalities, there was a deeper inequality. What do you think that was? What was responsible for all those inequalities? Anybody? I'm going to cold call. Yeah. Racism. So racism is an attitude, but how does it transform into that kind of daily circumstance?
Institutions.
Institutions? Laws? Well, for us, the key word was the 5-letter word that Dr. King defines as the ability to achieve purpose, also known as power. Also known as power. And, I think of Paul Tillich's Love, Power, and Justice as a really important book that isn't shy about making the connection that love without engagement with power can't produce justice, just as power without love can't produce justice. But we also want to embrace the love part, but forget about the power part. And so then we wind up abandoning projects of justice. And so for us, it was very clear that there was a deeper problem. African Americans couldn't vote. There was no political accountability. Economically, there was certainly no unions in Mississippi and a right-to-work state, but dependence on marginal plantation agriculture is not a way to develop economic capacity. And culturally, I'd never had the experience of going up to somebody twice my age who would stand up, offer me his chair, call me Mr., introduce himself with his first name and not look me in the eye because he was black and I was white. And those kind of interactions went on thousands of times a day across the South. So when you put together the cultural, economic, and political powerlessness that I just described, it's not any mystery that all those inequalities are there. Not because people wanted them, not because people gave up, but they simply did not have the capacity or the effective agency to change their conditions. Because every time they would try, they would be crushed. So it became very clear to us then that the question, if we were going to deal with this in justice terms as opposed to charity terms, was how do we deal with the power question? How do we restore agency? Well, some people said you look up for power. You look up. So you go to Washington, D.C., you say, hi, Washington, can we have a little of your power to fix this? Well, of course, you can imagine the general response was things like, do some more research, or you can testify before our committee, or these things take time, you have to be patient. And we discovered that unless the people who had the problem also could become authors of the change, it wasn't going to change. Nothing much was going to change. Nothing much was going to change, and it sure wasn't going to change in a musical way. All right, thank you. No, that unless there was a way to restore authorship to those with the problem, it wasn't going to change because what's given can be taken away. And so the question then is a dilemma because, gee, they got the problem because they're powerless. So then how do they get power? I mean, this is like a trap. Well, what we learned was that there's a difference between resources and power. And we learned that while many communities are lacking in power, they're not all lacking in resources. And so the challenge of the organizer was to figure out how to work with people in such a way that they could transform their resources into power. And to get less abstract about that, the event that really began the modern civil rights movement was the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955, organized by Dr. King and others. And it's worth reflecting for a moment on that, because those folks, they wanted to, buses at the time in Montgomery, it was blacks in the front, blacks in the back, whites in the front, no man's land in the middle, and the bus driver was armed and deputized to enforce that. So a black person getting on the bus would walk by, first by the armed bus driver, then all the rows of white people, and then find a seat and sit, and then if a white person got on that needed the seat, they would get up and have to give them the seat. So every time you got on a bus to go to work, it was a microcosm of the whole system. Twice a day, morning, afternoon. Just think about that for a moment. And think about the kind of anger that that kind of experience would produce, and then despair if it couldn't change. It was a real issue. It was segregation, but segregation made very real. And the community decided, after Brown v. Board of Education the year before, that maybe they would try to desegregate the buses, so they'd file a suit. And they were looking for a perfect plaintiff for this suit. And a couple of people had sat down and refused to get up and been arrested, but they didn't quite fit the profile. And then there was a woman who was the secretary of the NAACP chapter, had been trained in organizing at Highlander School, and sort of crossed class. She was a respectable seamstress, and that was Rosa Parks. And anybody who thinks that she was just a lady who one day got tired, you're missing the whole point. It was a strategic maneuver. And she was selected, and she was arrested, and she was going to be a litigant. But the Women's Committee at the State College there, led by a woman named Joanne Robinson, said, wait a second, we can't let Rosa go to jail without solidarity. They stayed up all night making leaflets and saying, let's stay off the buses in solidarity with Rosa. Check with Dr. King and the rest of them. They said, okay, they did it, and people stayed off the buses. And that's how the boycott began. And so what people discovered was they had a new source of power. And it wasn't by looking up, it was by looking down, way down. What was that source of power? Huh? Well, but what in particular, what resource did they discover they had? Feet. They had feet. Instead of using the feet to get on the bus, they could use the feet to walk to work. And if they all did it together, guess what? The bus company would be more dependent on the community than the community on the bus company. Resources transformed into power through collective action by revealing the interdependence that is at the heart of all power systems. And this, of course, is Gandhi's great insight of the power of non-cooperation. That one way or another, most systems of power require our cooperation, even if we're exploited by them. So this insight was a sort of key insight in terms of how to combine power and agency, how to make these things happen. And the third thing then that I learned from this was that this doesn't just happen by accident. You know, it's not because of sunspots or the weather. It takes skilled leadership. And the leadership that it took to organize the bus boycott and all this, Dr. King didn't come out of the womb being a leader. Where do you think he learned his leadership? You must know. Huh? Yeah, well, he was a PK. He was a double PK. I mean, his grandfather, his father, Baptist preachers like rabbis have to get hired by their congregations. And so if you aren't a pretty good organizer, you're out of work. So there's a lot of incentive to learn how to organize your community, not to mention the missionary societies, boards of deacons, and the whole rich infrastructure, the black church that trained leadership, or the black fraternals like the Prince Hall Masons, or the Sleeping Car Porters Union of A. Philip Randolph, that actually the guy who instigated the boycott in Montgomery, E.D. Nixon, was a porter. And he'd learned his organizing from in the A. Philip Randolph Union. So it taught me that, leadership, skilled, trained leadership, it takes to bring communities together, to learn how to use their resources, to create the power to make change. And I left the South after 2 years, and I won't be as long with every year. And came by here to Harvard, but I wasn't quite ready. I went back to California. Cesar Chavez had just started a grape strike 30 miles from where I grew up. And it was interesting. I grew up there. I grew up in the middle of the farm worker world, but I never saw it. I had to go to Mississippi and get educated about race, power, and politics in America to go back home and see, another community of people of color, no political voting rights to speak of, and economically dependent, no farm workers not covered under federal labor legislation. Of course, California had its own rich history of racial segregation going back with the Chinese to the turn of the century. And so it turned out Mississippi was not an exception of America, but rather an example of the underside of America. And so I began working with Cesar and did that for the next 16 years up until 1981, learning the same kinds of lessons, and then another 10 years of union issue and electoral work. And then, as Frank said, I got invited to my 25th reunion here at Harvard. Now, I was kind of surprised because I hadn't graduated. I still had this year to go. And what was up? And, Harvard's pretty smart. They know, like 25 years out, you're likely to have made some money and have a kid, and there's a convergence of interest there that's plausible. And then there are dropouts, that have done rather well. There's one up in Seattle that did pretty well. But for me, I'd been doing this stuff for all these years, and like so many activists, had just been doing. And I found myself starved. And I got here, I came to this reunion, it's the first one I ever came to, and I ran into a 20-year-old version of me that was still hanging out in the yard. And we had a conversation. How's it going? You know how you leave a little part of yourself behind in places that are very important. And how's it going? Well, okay, but I don't know, I'm feeling stuck. Well, why don't you come back and finish your senior year, said 20-year-old me. I thought, I don't know. And the last day, I went to see one of the deans, and his name was David Illingsworth, and he was an Episcopal priest, it turned out. And if he'd laughed at me, I was so fragile, it would have been the end of it. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about the fact that tuition had changed a little bit in the intervening period. We came up with a plan. So in 1991, I came back, finished my senior year, wrote my senior thesis in history and government on declining political participation, and graduated class of 64-92. And my 81-year-old mother got to come and see her son finally become a college graduate. He was going to make something of himself now. And, but I got the bug and then did the master's at the Kennedy School, PhD in sociology. And while I was working on the PhD, was asked by the Kennedy School to design a course on organizing, which then turned out to be a real blessing for me, because it was a way for me to integrate my life experience with social science in a conversation with a rising generation. And those old sources of renewal about young people and the energy of young people for changing the world, of the responsibility to change the world, of the consequences of racism or whatever version of it objectifies other people, came alive again. And I came to think of going to class to teach as really having a conversation with the future. Every day, every time. And so it's been a blessing for me to have the opportunity to teach. And it's in that context that I began to really dig back into this whole question of narrative and story, and just what is that all about? I actually realized just last year that all the courses I teach are all about the same thing. I realized that they're all about Hillel's three questions. They're all about the relationship of self, us, and now. The course I taught for 5 years with Bernie Steinberg from Harvard Hillel, we called it Moral Leadership, and it was a course about reflecting on classical texts, religious texts, but not only religious texts, as a resource for your own reflection on self. Pretty reflective. The public narrative class I teach is about how to communicate to others your story, their story, to create the conditions for action. And the organizing class I teach is about the action. It's about the other end. And it's interesting that the anxiety scale goes up. The reflection, students are very calm. That's all very calm, reflective. Public narrative, I don't know, I gotta be vulnerable. I gotta reveal myself to other people and communicate and take risks, okay. And then organizing, whoa, that's really scary, because now I've gotta get other people committed to take action, and what if it doesn't work out, and all the fears that come into play there. So, but it was a surprise to me, yeah, that's actually what I've been doing. And I wanna focus today just on the narrative piece. At sort of the middle piece, the middle transition piece. And it became very interesting to me because in my days of movement work, of organizing, there was a lot of talk about strategy and how important strategy was. And, you got to figure out how to do this maneuver and that maneuver. But, there wasn't going to be any action in the civil rights movement in the South unless there was church. I mean, the mass meetings. The sources of courage, the solidarity. I mean, without that, you can have the best strategy in the world, and it was like having a car with no gas. Nothing was going to happen. And then when the farm workers in California, it wasn't a Baptist church anymore. It was Mexican Catholic tradition. It was celebrating huelga masses, masses in support of the cause. It was that celebration of community and of sharing that was also a source of powerful motivation and solidarity. And so I was always really interested in this motivation side. What's happening over there? And when I came back to school, I discovered that, yes, in fact, psychologists had studied this. And in fact, Jerome Bruner had written a lot about it. And that, in fact, there was a way to think about the fact that we learn to know the world in at least three ways. We learn with our hands, we learn with our heads, and we learn with our hearts. That we cognitively map the world in terms of where things are and what they are, and this is very useful for understanding how to do things and answer strategic questions. But we can't get to the why questions. Why does it matter from that? And we also map the world affectively. What's good for us? What's bad for us? What's scary? What's disgusting? What's promising? And what's hopeful? And it's that second mapping, that affective mapping, is the mapping that actually establishes and communicates the value we place on things. The value we place on things and people. And so it was important to understand that if we were going to get into the question of motivation, then we had to get into the question of emotion. And of course, it's the same root word, emotion, motivation, that which moves us and motivates us. And appreciating that values are not intellectual concepts, but they're emotional commitments. They're emotional commitments. And that if we're actually going to look to value as sources of motivation, we have to understand the language of emotion in order to speak them. So it's not saying that reason and emotion are somehow, well, you know what the usual deal is. Oh, emotion bad, reason good, got to tap. It's not an argument that emotion good, reason bad. It's that they're interdependent. And that the emotional context has everything to do with our capacity to exercise agency. And I want to talk a little bit more about that because that's what's at the core of what narrative is all about. Martha Nussbaum, interestingly, writes in Unsettled Thoughts about the interesting research of people with damaged amygdalas who can't experience much in the way of motion. And what she reports is, what they can do, they can reason options till they're blue in the face. You know what they can't do? Decide. They can't decide. They can't make decisions because decisions rest on value judgments, and value judgments require emotional information. So emotional information is very important for understanding where, why, and how, and where the value is. So I came to see that, okay, you can understand the how questions with the cognitive stuff, but you can't get to the whys. You have to get into the emotional domain if you want to understand the why. Why this value over that one? Why this priority over that one? What is that? What is that about? Now, we know that there are certain kinds of emotions that facilitate mindful action and others that inhibit it. And I'm talking about mindful action. I'm talking about the exercise of agency. I'm not talking about reaction. I'm talking about purposeful action. George Marcus, the political psychologist, cites the relevance of two neurophysiological systems of the surveillance system and dispositional systems of the brain as a way to kind of understand this. Most of the time, we're operating on autopilot. We operate out of habit, right? Most of the time. But we have a mechanism in the brain to alert us when habit won't do. You're driving along, you're on autopilot, truck pulls in front. Your brain goes, oh, truck. Surveillance system alert, you experience it as anxiety. And that experience of anxiety is a beneficial experience because it says, break habit. You got to deal with this. You got to pay attention to this. And so the challenge facing organizers and leaders is very often how to break through habitual ways of understanding, thinking, and acting and reacting in order to get enough attention that a person will actually consider thinking about it in a new way. And that will not happen no matter how many arguments you make. I mean, I saw it so clear when I was organizing farm workers and have a wonderful leaflet, on all the benefits of the union and pension plans and all this stuff, and workers coming out of a labor camp who were afraid to look me in the eye, let alone take the leaflet, let alone read it. That unless we had a way to deal, to break through that, nothing was going to happen. So, the significance of urgency, of creating urgency, which is something organizers get very, very good at. Because the urgent will always supplant the important. Urgency is not about time, it's about priority. And so that's why deadlines, campaigns always operate that way, right? What about apathy? How do you deal with that? Well, anger. And by anger, I don't mean rage, I mean outrage. I mean the contradiction, the tension we feel when we encounter a difference between the world as it is and the way it ought to be. And we feel that tension. It's like that a couple of years ago in New Bedford, they raided those places and took away all those parents without papers, and they left all those kids stranded all over the damn place. Make you angry? It sure ought to. If it didn't, there's something wrong with you, I would argue. So organizers get the rap of being called agitators because They're often about creating tension, the tension that can be resolved ultimately only through action. So we've got one piece of work here, which is urgency and anger getting attention, but then you've created all this anxiety, so then what happens? Well, that's where the next tier, that's where the dispositional system comes in, and disposition runs from enthusiasm down to depression, down to despair, or we might say from hope to depression. Now, or hope to despair, rather. So if anxiety hits and you're like Eeyore, remember Eeyore? Who remembers Eeyore? All right. And you know, Winnie the Pooh says, "Good morning, Eeyore." And what does Eeyore say? Yeah, it's always very down, you know, it's always very down. The point is that if you're down there in that place and anxiety hits, you're then likely to be very curious and figure out creative solutions to the problem? No. You're most likely to run away, strike out, or freeze like a deer in the headlights, also known as fear. And the fear reaction to challenge is the source of so much destructive behavior. So much destructive behavior, so much destructive politics, so much destructive action. So then the question is, okay, on the other hand, if you respond, if you're up here in the enthusiasm domain and you respond instead of fear hopefully, what happens then? You're much more likely to explore, to ask questions. Your curiosity will be stimulated. You are much more likely to come up with creative responses. So the argument here is that hope is not simply a feel-good. Hope is a precondition for effective and creative problem solving. Okay? It's a precondition. Now by hope, I don't mean flowers in May, la la la. You know, where do we get hope? Where do we get hope? Where do we get hope? We get it from other people sometimes. We get it out of relationships. Sometimes we mine our own experience, right? For moments of resilience, moments that we can draw upon, that others share with us, sometimes our faith traditions. Another place we get hope is plausible pathways of action. I like the definition that's been attributed to Maimonides of hope, which says, hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. Let me say that again. That to be a realist is to recognize that the world is not only a world of probability, but also one of possibility. That sure, Goliath wins most of the time, but you know what? David can win. A black man could be elected president of the United States, as improbable as that was, until it happened. Respect for possibility, to me, is a whole lot of what hope is all about. Respect for possibility. How else do you deal? Isolation. Isolation's another paralyzer. How do you deal with that? Empathy, solidarity, community, connection. Self-doubt, another one. I can't do it. People like me can't do it. We're not worthy of doing it. How do you deal with that? Well, in organizing, we call it ICMED, which means you can make a difference, also known as self-efficacy, also, I think, known as dignity, also known as a sense of belovedness, of worth, of worthiness. So an organizer or a leader who wants to really deal with moving people into action to confront serious challenges, first has the challenge of making the challenge real, but then secondly, inspiring the hope, the empathy, and the sense of self-worth that makes constructive action possible. So it isn't enough to have a good strategy. It requires mastering the language of emotion. Now, what does narrative have to do with that? What do stories have to do with that? Well, what happens in a story? Most stories, all stories, consist of three things. They have a plot, they have a character, and they have a moral, okay? And I've yet to find where this is not so. It may be so somewhere. Haven't found it yet. So what makes a plot a plot? I got up this morning, went to school, got in my car, came over here, and I'm giving a speech. Is that a plot? All right, make it a plot for me. Make it a plot for me. Yeah.
You woke up this morning and you were overcome with this sense of self-doubt. And as throughout the day, you really struggled struggled with how you will effectively give this speech, and even though poring over your notes did not do so, and it was not until you had some great realization beforehand that you were able to get up here and give this fantastic.
All right, this is good. So now what was the great realization? When was this? What was this moment? Help me.
You could talk to a handsome Jewish divinity student.
Where is one of those? I don't know. Yes, it would be more interesting if, consumed in self-doubt, I was wandering down Francis Avenue and there was a vision appeared of a Jewish divinity student. No, but you get the point, right? I mean, in other words, what creates a plot is a breach. It's a breach in what's expected. It's the unexpected. It's not just conflict. It's like there's a break here. Where did this come from? It's the truck pulling in front of the car. It's that moment. And that's when we all get interested. Up to that point, we're not interested, we're bored. That's when we lean forward, we start paying attention, and we spend billions of dollars a year on movies and books and that all are structured in the same way. So what is that all about? Why is it so important? What do we care so much about? Why did you start paying attention when he started telling about my little crisis there and then wondering what was going to happen and so forth? Why did you pay attention? Yeah, but why? Why? I mean, I don't know. Why is it of interest to you? Are you giving speeches at the Divinity School? I mean, why?
If you could do it, maybe we can.
Oh, so when you're called upon to give a speech at the Divinity School, you'll be prepared?
I think of
You think of me. What do you really want to know?
you. No, what's happening?
Huh? Yeah, well, why do you want to know what? Look, see, it's like how many times a day does the unexpected happen in your life? In little ways, maybe the movie's sold out of tickets and you have to change your plans, or big ways. Marriages break up, people lose their jobs, people get thrown out of school. It's core to the texture of the human experience to be confronted with the unexpected for which we are not prepared. To me, that's when we're at our most human. That's what the experience of agency is, not when the rules are all there and it's all clear what to do. It's when, hey, you know what? You got to choose. You got to decide what to do here. And it's both exhilarating and terrifying. And we seem infinitely curious about how to deal with it. How to deal with it. And it's not about how to deal with the speech at the Divinity School. It's like, where did he get the courage? Where did he get the resourcefulness? Where did he get the forbearance? How did he figure it out? What was the source of creativity? This is all these novels and all these plays and all these books. And because the character, the protagonist, the character, we can identify empathetically with the character. And because we can identify, we not only get it in the head, we feel it in the heart. We can feel the fear, we can feel the hope, we can feel the source of courage. And so the moral that the story teaches is not simply haste makes waste, it is the experience of haste making waste, or a stitch in time saving 9, or whatever it might be. It is the experience of that, and so the story teaches the heart, not just the head. And you know, ask yourselves, why do all our faith traditions, cultural traditions, family traditions teach through narrative? They're teaching us how to act, how to exercise agency, how to exercise choice, how to deal with uncertainty in ways rooted in values central to that tradition, that faith, that community, that family. Jerome Bruner reports on research on parents with small kids, and 85% of the time that parents spend with small children are in storytelling. Just to keep them busy? No, usually it's some version of, well, there's Uncle Charlie now. You don't want to be like Uncle Charlie. But Aunt Harriet, now, there's your model, see Aunt Harriet. Bruner describes it as training and agency, all that storytelling. Training and agency. So narrative then becomes a way in which we learn to access the emotional resources or moral resources that can equip us to deal with the challenges of uncertainty, the unexpected, and all the rest. Now, how does this come back to Hillel's 3 questions and to leadership? Well, one way to think about the role of narrative in leadership is to reflect on actually, it's the first place that I read it. This is Exodus, I believe it's Exodus 3. Moses, who's sort of my favorite character because he's first organizer. Well, he's an insider out. He's a Jew who's an Egyptian. He's of the oppressed. He's raised in the house of the oppressor. That's a common circumstance in a lot of places. And it's confusing. It's creative and it's confusing. And he's so confused, his rage takes over when he first sort of confronts that reality. He goes off to the desert where you go in the Bible when you're trying to figure stuff out. And he finds a wife and he finds and he has a child. And he's walking along one day with his sheep. And he sees a glow off the side of the road, and he's a curious guy, and so he steps off the road to see what it is. And so there's this bush, and the bush is burning, and it's not consumed. And so then he hears the voice, Moses, or Moses. We don't know. We're not sure about what exactly the timbre of the voice was. And you're called to free your people. And what's Moses' first question? Why me? Why me? Second question. Who are you and who are these? Third, couldn't this wait a little bit? I got it. And that's when God negotiates Aaron and the staff and all the rest of the stuff in order to get him to take up the commission. The linking of self, us, now as a response to challenge is a pretty old linking. And it precedes Hillel. And so in the context of public leadership, then the question is, how do I then tell a story of self? How do I tell a story of us? And how do I tell a story of now? Now, let me just look at those for just a second. First thing, story of self. Going back to Hillel, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? What does this really mean? What does accepting responsibility for myself mean, really? Created in God's image, we are each of infinite moral worth, capable of choice, and utterly unique. But our days are finite, our reach limited, and we have more to learn than we can ever know. We begin as children of our parents, their learning, their community. As we embrace them and struggle with them, we begin to author who we are in relation to them. As works in progress, we grow as siblings, friends, students, lovers, spouses, workers, colleagues, congregants, and citizens, and many of us become parents ourselves. In facing challenges, making choices, and living with consequences in both sorrow and in joy, we learn to love what we love, know what we know, and do what we do. To be for oneself is to honor sources of one's own worth, strength, and limitations. To find the courage, commitment, and creativity to face the challenges that we face as selves requires learning, as Charles Taylor describes it, to access our own moral sources, our own sources of value and of courage in order to act. So now the story of self, the idea of the story of self is telling a story, taking a moment of our experience and telling a story to others that allows others to get us. It's not about a resume, it's about a moment. Stories are episodic, they're rooted in episodic memory, the capacity we have to remember events and moments, not just facts. And telling a story, as I told a little bit at the beginning, about what moved me, why I'm called, is what a story of self is. What challenge did I face? What choice did I make? What outcome? And your capacity to identify with me allows you to begin to get something of what's moving me, of what kind of values, of what's important to me, and what matters. This means I have to accept a certain level of vulnerability because I have to actually share something about why I'm here. You can see a good example of this in Barack Obama's Democratic Convention speech in 2004, that everyone, and you watch the first 7 minutes of his talk, the first 2 minutes are a story of self. It's making that contact. And so mining your own experience for those moments of choice in your own life that you can share with others by inviting them into those moments is, I believe, a fundamental challenge of public leadership. and certainly of moral leadership. Now, lots of people say, I don't want to talk about myself, or I have a boring life, no one would be interested, nobody would care. My view is that if you enter public life, you have a responsibility to own your story. Remember what happened to poor John Kerry? John Kerry had his story stolen from him. The Swift boaters took charge of his story because he could not author his own story. He couldn't own it. He couldn't own it and couldn't tell it. So if you're in public life, you have no choice, because other people will tell your story for you if you don't tell it. And so you have to step up and learn how to do this. And look, who in this room has not experienced pain? Who in this room has not experienced loss? And who in this room has not experienced hope? If you hadn't experienced pain, why would you think the world needed improvement? And if you hadn't experienced hope, why would you think you had a ghost of a chance of making it happen? Our own repository, our own store of narratives are a rich resource on which we can call to engage others, move others, and challenge others to act. Now that's the second part. What about if I'm the first part? If I'm for myself alone, what am I? Telling a story of us. Relationships, entering into relationships are not simply about aggregation, but it's about association. And the learning of the head and the heart that comes with that. That was the significance of de Tocqueville's argument as to the importance of civic associationism in the US, not as a way to protect individual liberty, but as a way to develop common understandings, shared understandings, common concerns. Hillel goes even deeper. He says, if I think only of myself, I lose my humanity. I'm no longer a who, I become a what. To be a self is to be in relationship with others, and in them, sources of the values that give meaning to our lives. Our relational reality challenges us to recognize our limitations, but at the same time enables our aspirations. To be in relationship, however, is about justice, not charity. Relationship demands recognition of the other as a self, equally created in God's image, unique and capable of choice. It is to do with the other, not to the other or even for the other. Entering into relationship requires speaking and listening, exploring values, interests, resources concerning commonalities and differences, and forging commitments to shared projects. Relationships are demanding because they require giving of ourselves, not only of our goods. Now, learning to tell a story of us. How many of you have ever worked in a work site where a bunch of people go and they're there and then you go home and there's absolutely no sense of us there at all? You had that experience? People are sort of present in the same place. And then maybe you've had the experience of going to a place where, boy, there's this strong sense of shared us in that place. What's the difference? What's the difference between those two? What do you think makes the difference in those? Well, anybody? So one, if there's relationships formed, it certainly helps. What else makes a difference?
There's investment in each other.
All right, there's investment, and if the project is an interdependent one where people depend on each other to do the project, that certainly helps. But there's another piece. Huh? It's more fun, yeah, no, sure. There's another piece, which is that there is, yeah, go ahead. Huh? Yeah, definitely. Common goal, common purpose. Oh, now we're sparking. Okay, we got a lot of, what? Well, I want to point to a particular piece of work that gets done. It's all these things, which is that person or people who are saying, hey, remember the time that? Remember how this started? Or remember when Joe joined us and this happened? And remember that there's a storyteller. Or there are storytellers who are putting into narrative form the values that that community shares. That's what a story of us is. And it's constructed, it's created, and we're all parts of many, many us's. I mean, and these are us's not as categories, but as shared experience, shared values. I mean, I asked a moment ago, how many people in this room have ever experienced loneliness? How many people have ever experienced doubt? How many people have experienced I mean, an us is created out of shared experience and the values at the root of those shared experience, not simply categories and identity boxes and specification groups. And so the challenge of the leadership challenge is to create the experience of a shared us. And of course, anybody that goes to church or mosque or synagogue or wherever, this is what happens every week, right? We're telling the story of us. And we put it into ritual, and we put it into all kinds of practices and dramatic presentations, and we're celebrating those values that make us the us that we are, and we go there for hope, and we go there for solidarity, and we go there for a sense of worth. Finally, Hillel's third question. If not now, when? What does that mean? Does it mean that the only things worth doing are what we can do right now? Does it mean that we should act without thinking? I don't think either. Hillel's question implies reflection and relationship, implies that unless reflection and relationship result in action, it's self-indulgence. Action requires commitment of time, of money, of effort, and committing resources requires making choices, and making choices shapes who we are. So by taking action, we not only change the world around us, we change ourselves. But action is challenging, it's risky, it's uncertain, it's ambiguous, and because it is so challenging, we're easily caught in what Tolstoy called the snare of preparation. A little more study, another degree, a little more planning, a little more certainty, a little more research, and then I'll finally be ready to act. Hillel's question teaches us that changing ourselves in the world depends on action, a capacity that flows from our status not as knowers, experts with all the answers, but our courage as learners, faithful questioners who accept that we can learn to create a new world only through the work of creating it. So it's a call to action, a story of now. What is the challenge to our values that requires action? What's a source of hope? And what choice are we being called upon to make now? You know, how many people have heard or seen or remember the I Have a Dream speech of Dr. King? Let's see. Okay. You know, it's interesting to reflect on that speech because the title was really The Fierce Urgency of Now. You know, and the context was everybody saying, it'll take time, it'll take time, it'll take time. And the whole thrust of the March on Washington, 1963, was to challenge the Kennedy administration to act now. And the phrase was freedom now, not sometime in the future after all the plans have been made. And if you go back and listen to that speech, there's sanitized versions of that speech that all they give you is the little black children and little white children going to play together and that whole sort of vision of they forget the dream is preceded by a nightmare. And Dr. King is very explicit about the nightmare and about what it means to not have a place to rest at night and have to tell your child you can't drink out of that fountain. He is very explicit about the anger. And it is a very challenging speech. And it is sad that it gets so sanitized and so domesticated into sort of this dreamy, wishy thing when it's not that at all. But he also recognized that that challenge without hope just leads to despair. And so the challenge then, the leadership challenge then is how on the one hand do I make the challenge real and how on the other hand do I inspire the hope to act? One of my favorite stories of now is actually Henry V, the We Happy Few speech, you know, the St. Crispin's Day. And it's really interesting because, you know, everybody's so discouraged and the French are overwhelming there and they're about to give up. And the first thing Henry does there is say, look, you don't have to be here. You can leave if you want. Right away, he restores agency, first thing. And, you know, he never promises victory. He never even demonizes the French. It's all about who his people are and the values they represent. And if you go through and look at any of these locker room speeches, Friday Night Lights or Al Pacino in Any Given Sunday, whatever, it's very interesting. None of them promise victory. They're all about lifting up the value of that community and its call to action as worthy in itself. It's a very interesting observation. All right, let me conclude now because it's been a while. Let me just conclude with this, that the biggest challenge that I think that I see my students face is, you get to action and Story of Us and all the rest, and the hardest thing is letting other people lead. The hardest thing is understanding how to be okay with enabling others to lead. And we have a little chart we use. It has a little dot, and in the dot, pointing at the dot are all these arrows, and there's tons of arrows pointing at the dot, and some of the arrows can't even get in. And I usually ask people, so you've been in an organization, how many of you have ever been the dot? Let me see, how many people here have ever been the dot? Come on, be honest about it. How many have ever tried to work with a dot? You work with somebody who's like, look, it is a real problem. And I don't know, maybe it's just a Harvard problem, but I don't think so. But it sure is a Harvard problem because, see, there's something about the wish for control, the hope for control, I should say, the desire that it be done well, the difficulty of being comfortable with other people making mistakes and the fact that that would be okay, the whole idea that failing is necessary for learning, that you don't learn to ride a bike by studying bicycleology, that you learn to ride a bike by getting on it and falling, and then finding the courage to get back up again. And so it's really hard for people to let go of that, of being that dot. And now sometimes the reaction to the dot is so strong that people say, we're not going to have any dots here, we're all leaders. We're all leaders, and then you go off in the other direction. And what Joe Freeman, the sociologist, called the tyranny of structurelessness. Sort of the idea that there could be a structuralist group, because there never is. There's always structure, but it's underneath, it's not visible, and you can't hold it accountable. It's just factions and personal. So there's a middle ground, which is what we've been actually working on since for the last few years, which is developing a model of collaborative and distributed leadership based on leadership teams. And we introduced this to the Obama campaign in 2007 when we were launching the Camp Obamas. And there was no way there was enough staff. And relying on a single volunteer leader was so fragile because the person would either burn out or try to do it all. And so we realized that we could take what we know about teams and introduce it into the context of organizing and develop leadership teams. And so these Camp Obamas launched hundreds of leadership teams, actually, as a balance between the two. But the biggest challenge was being okay with that. And, it's something that in my organizing class right now we struggle with. So I just want to end with a story about that. There's actually, in Kabbalah, there's this question, the idea is called Tzimtzum. And the question is, if God is all-knowing and all-powerful and all-present, then how do people ever get to make choices? And the answer is, he constricts himself to create space for us to make choices, constricting ourselves to allow others the space to lead so that we can actually develop the leadership of others and not be the black hole that consumes everything. Now, where's the source for this? Let's go to Exodus 18. In Exodus 18, Moses is sort of halfway along with the people. We're going back to my organizer here. And they've overcome a lot of crises. And his father-in-law, Jethro, arrives with his wife and his 2 kids. And Jethro shows up, wife and kids. And Moses is doing his thing. And it's as if Jethro's saying, hey there, wife, kids, remember these? And Moses has to be very respectful, right? Because this is his father-in-law. It's interesting, he's not a Hebrew, right? He's a Midianite priest, which is also kind of an important aspect to this story. And so he asks Moses, how's it going? And Moses proceeds to complain. It's just been horrible. There's been this, and there's been this, and there's been this. And Jethro says, yeah, I've noticed what great blessings the Lord has visited upon you. It's like Moses is so consumed in this thing, he's lost perspective on the extraordinary thing that's happening. And that's the first thing Jethro does as he restores his family to him. And then they celebrate and so forth. Then the next morning, second half of the chapter, Jethro watched Moses go to work. And Moses is, and the way that the Bible describes it, Moses is sitting on the ground. And the people are towering over him, literally towering over him, like the dot with all the arrows, people towering over him. And Jethro takes a look at this and he says, wait a second. He says, this is not good. He says, you're going to burn yourself out and you're going to burn the people out. Well, what should I do? Well, you got to do three things, says Jethro. The first one is you have to educate the people. You have to share knowledge of the law with the people. You can't be the only one with all the information. Interesting, isn't it? You can't use information. Second, you got to find people of good character, people who won't take bribes, people of respect and integrity out there. And then third, you have to give them authority. One over every 10 can decide about those 10, and one over every one of those 10, and so forth. And only the most critical stuff comes to you. And clearly, Jethro's the first management consultant in history. I mean, this is like, I mean, Jethro, LL, whatever. But the interesting thing is Moses does it right then. That's sort of a puzzle. Why does he just automatically do it? I think the answer lies in coupling the two parts of that chapter together, in putting the first with the second. See, Moses is so absorbed in that task that his identity is so wrapped up with it that he can't risk anything about it because he will risk his very being. So he can't let anybody else have responsibility. So what happens in the first half? First of all, Jethro reminds him that he's also a husband. He's also a father. He is a person outside this task. He is a person outside this task, beloved not only of his wife and his children, but he is also a person beloved of God. Something we would all do well to remember. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, when? Thank you very much. Can we do some questions? Do you have time?
So thank you very much.